Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome to episode 4 of the Bad Eye Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, the Archduke of asinine introductions, the Kaiser of Canadian amateur podcasts written on weeknights after 1 a.m., the Patricia of part-time political commentators, coming at you in medium definition, because you guys honestly aren't ready for the high-quality audio. My voice would break your brains. Whether in like a sexy way or a Lovecraftian, incomprehensible horror way is for you to decide. But the facts are the facts, and the fact is, you are unprepared. We got a very special episode for you this week for a couple of reasons. We're going to be talking about the Ontario provincial election, because despite the fact that Canadian politics makes me want to scoop my eyeballs out and plug my ears with them whenever anyone starts talking about it, it turns out the provincial government actually does stuff, and it does matter whether you vote and who you vote for. So to help me prevent you from scooping your eyes out, we got our first ever guest host here on the Bad Eye Podcast, hopefully the first of many. So we're going to be trying it a bit more freeform this week. The past few episodes have been a bit more scripted, and we might still be doing that from time to time because it's honestly really hard for me to talk for a whole hour uninterrupted and have it come out sounding like anything remotely coherent. But today I've got someone to talk to. So if you could all join me at home in giving a big bad eye welcome to Patricia, our first guest host. Patricia's a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, Nunatsiavut Inuk, and an all-around rad human being who, as soon as I dropped episode 1 of the pod, immediately messaged me with like 17 cool ideas for things to talk about. So I'm extremely excited to have her here, and I hope you guys enjoy the discussion we're about to have. So with the intro out of the way, I want to say hi. Welcome to the pod. Thanks for being with us. I hope that you found it easy to get onto this platform because I wasn't sure how you'd find the software, but I'm excited to get into it with you.
Yeah, no, this is, I'm looking forward to this conversation, so for your listeners, me and Andrew both attended Trinity College at the University of Toronto together for a time. I then transferred to McGill to keep my sanity intact, but, Andrew made it out mostly unscathed from Trin, which I think is it's a pretty big accomplishment. So, I'm glad to see you out here on the other side in podcast land anyway.
I appreciate that. I feel like I don't get enough credit for making it out mostly unscathed. So I really appreciate that somebody's finally giving me recognition for that. That's great. Thank you. Okay. So this coming week, there's an election in Ontario, a provincial election, as most elections in Ontario are. I feel like I wanted to do a provincial election special primarily because whenever the provincial election comes up, I mean, I always vote in it, but I always kind of like historically, I've kind of thought to myself, like, why am I doing this? Like, what's the point? I like to vote. I'm kind of a civic duty nerd in that way. And so I would never not vote. But I feel like I personally have really undersold for myself the extent to which the provincial government has direct impact over my life. And I think that a lot of people, who maybe did not pay attention in civics like I did, like I did not, rather.
You don't have a civics class?
I did get to have a civics class. Well, and this is the thing that like I feel like I've really set up a trap for myself because like I actually find Canada and Canadian politics like incredibly boring. And here I am like doing a politics podcast, and I was like, I live in Canada, so like I should talk about Canadian politics, but like my entry into like political consciousness and thinking about politics and the world is like American politics and global politics. Like I like European politics. I know a lot better than I know Canadian politics, which is kind of ironic that I'm like here doing this, but I mean, that's part of the reason that I wanted specifically to talk about Canada is that I was like, I don't know enough, and I fucking live here, so like I should know. Like I do genuinely believe that it's like important to be like a person who's engaged in civil society and a person who like is a good citizen of the place that they live. But I find our form of government and also our politicians like just objectively uninteresting, and so. I'm
also
hoping
like our form of government is also very elitist, like compared to a lot of other countries.
That's true. They literally wear wigs, like
yeah, and things like in Canada, the only referendums we ever get to have are on the Constitution. Like,
yeah,
in say there's lots of reasons why maybe direct citizen referendums are bad, but like a lot of the bad policy in California is made by referendum, for example.
sure.
But there's also like some cool victories you could have because of it. Like in Orange County, Florida, the Everglades are legal people, the same way that corporation is. because of a direct referendum that won by like 80%. And so like in Canada, I do feel like it's like elitist folks, the people who are at the top of the pyramid benefit from elitism. And so
Yeah.
if they can like confuse and bore people, then they can like kind of like run insider baseball between each other instead of like actually being responsive to like the citizenry.
I think that is 100% accurate. But yeah, I mean, I like one of the reasons that I wanted to do the provincial election special with a guest host is that I'm hoping that with two people, like I can successfully make this not, so boring that like everyone listening wants to scoop their eyes out and plug their ears with them. So
What
with
an
that
image.
being said, yeah, let's get into it. There's going to be a provincial election this coming week. Obviously, there are four major parties in Ontario, which if you are in Ontario, you probably already know: the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the NDP, and the Green Party. I want to talk first about, why you should care about this, because as I was saying, like in the abstract knew why I should care, but like, I think that a lot of the things that when we talk about, like when federal elections come around, a lot of the things that we talk about, like healthcare, like housing, education, transportation, those are things that like very often the fuck Trudeau crowd will come out and, whenever there's like, oh, housing is too expensive, fuck Trudeau. Healthcare isn't good enough, fuck Trudeau. The government, the federal government isn't in charge of any of that.
No.
They direct some of that policy, but like healthcare is like, it's not CHIP, it's OHIP because it's the Ontario Health Insurance Plan. Like
Right.
your
Unlike the NHS in the UK, which is the National Healthcare Service, right? Like we
yeah,
don't have an NHS in Canada.
we don't have one. We have provincial healthcare. We have provincial housing. That's who decides housing policy in the place that you live, wherever you live, whether you're in Ontario, whether you're in any other province in Canada, it's the provincial government who decides that. Your provincial government is in charge of education policy for the province. They decide what gets taught. They're the reason that I also did not pay attention in civics, because I don't know if other people got civics, but I definitely did, and I did. It was boring. But they're in charge of transportation. I mean, the municipal government is also in charge of transportation, but I think that a lot of things that the provincial government does, like it's the most, people understand what the city government does. People understand what their local
People are
municipal
like, I
government
want my
does.
garbage to get taken away. Like they
Exactly.
understand like that is close to their home.
Another thing that I think people never think about, like, I mean, this is also a municipal thing, but a lot of the carceral state, like a lot of prisons, a lot of policing, that's done at the provincial level, and they have a lot of discretion about what to do, in terms of like provincial police budgets, and in terms of like building new prisons, building or closing down prisons, things like that. So on that note, the first thing that I want to talk about, with respect to this provincial election and the provincial government is, did you hear about Doug Ford suggesting to a room full of cops that he would bring back the death penalty? I think I have a quote that I'll give, and then we can react to it.
Please.
This is from CTV, so I'm gonna read their reporting directly. Progressive conservative leader Doug Ford does not support the death penalty, a spokesperson said in a statement Thursday night. That's in response to a comment he made at a recent London police gala on January 29th, where he appeared to endorse the return of the death penalty. God forbid they kill an innocent person. I don't even give them 25 years. I send them right to Sparky, and then we'll take care of everything from there. That was what he had to say about home invaders. His spokesperson said the premier made a poor taste joke out of frustration for the many people affected by violent criminals out on our streets because of the federal government's broken bail system and soft on crime policies. He has repeatedly called for harsher penalties, and this is my favorite part of the reporting. This is the last thing I'll say is the remark elicited groans and some light applause. So even in the room full of cops, people were like, dude, what the fuck? The London
Oh my
Police
God.
Association, which, like, I don't know if anyone listening knows anything about London, Ontario, but the fact that even the London Police Association was like, yo, my guy, that's really something.
Wow. What he was saying, like, God forbid they kill an innocent person. I was like, wait, I thought Andrew said that Doug was pro death penalty. So is he like doing like an even if, like, oh gosh, well, I mean, even if they kill an innocent person, like people, like I thought the next sentence was gonna be like people need to be punished for their crime, not realizing that the
Yeah, and that's like it's one thing to be like, I'm gonna bring back the death penalty. He went to the electric chair. Like that's even Americans don't use the electric chair. Like that's crazy to me. That's one step away from firing squads. Like he was just like, yeah, no, we're just gonna hang people. Like that's yeah. The electric chair is
execution fact.
for the record, the last people I looked it up, the last people executed in Ontario were hung in 1967 in Toronto. That's insane that he was just like he thought that would play well, I guess. Like that was I feel like we do not have I mean, we do have political consultants in this country, but they're so bad at their jobs. Like who thought this was a good idea to say on TV?
Well, but the thing that really worries me about this comment is like I don't think the death penalty will come back if somehow Doug Ford wins the next election. But like the thing Doug Ford is good at is campaigning, not governing. And so like if he's gotten worse at campaigning, what is that going to say about his governing?
That's an excellent point. That is, I mean, he's missing all his shots. That's all I can say. Like, I would hope that him being worse at campaigning means that he will lose the election. But yeah, I mean, that's true. He's always, I mean, the one thing I will give him credit for is he is a fairly savvy politician. And I think this was I don't want to say a rare misstep for him, but I think he thought this would play much better than it did. Like, I think that I do think that he was correctly reading the room in some ways, not the room full of cops. Like obviously he was correctly reading that room, and that like yes, cops are
They're
going to be
usually into
generally
punishing people. Yeah.
yes. Although I feel like send him right to Sparky is like that's egregious. I like that's even for cops. They were like, dude, like we shoot people. We're not barbarians. Like,
Yeah,
but no, it's I think that and I know this because I've been hearing it anecdotally from people. Like whenever I feel like people have been talking about Toronto, and I don't know if this is, a thing that has made it to where you are, but like people have been talking about Toronto since the pandemic, like it's New York in the 70s. Like they're just like we have running gun battles in the streets, and like the Bronx is on fire, and we're like, and look, like I recently started driving. Like it's just the reality of where I live in the city now. And so I hadn't taken the TTC in a while. And I like recently took the subway the other day. And I will say, like, it felt markedly different. And I don't know if that's just because I'm bougie now or if it's because there like legitimately were more like visibly like mentally unwell people like shouting. Like that was always kind of a thing. But like I feel like it might have been a little bit worse. But the way that people talk about it now is like we're fucking Mad Max Thunderdome, and so I do think that like he's responding to something. Like there is a
right.
general vibe
Right.
that people have that like things are kind of crazy, and I think he wildly overshot what people want him to do about it. But I don't know. I think it's a troubling trend.
Yeah, no, and I think like the thing that a lot of people don't always connect the dots on is that like the rise in crime and the rise in the cost of living are related to each other because sending people to prison does not bring crime rates down. Indeed, sending people to prison is a really good way to cause people to have to commit more crimes because once you go to prison, it then becomes immensely difficult to get a regular job. And so what actually needs to happen is like we need to have actual affordable housing programs, which often means that the government needs to physically build public housing, not this weird capitalist version of public housing where they're like, we're gonna incentivize condo builders to build condos where the first floor is cheaper for the first 20 years that the building exists or whatever weird policies they're trying to do lately. But like, if we actually need to build public housing that is owned by the government, and like for people who are like, oh, like, I don't want the government to pay for anything. Think of it this way: those buildings will have people in them pay. It's literally the government becomes a landlord. Like if you are pro individual people being a landlord, how could you not be pro the government being a landlord? It's a sound business model. Like you own things and then you rent them to other people. Like the public housing literally pays for itself, right?
I think that's a good segue into his housing policy, which is, I mean,
Not.
like his plan is basically just to make being homeless illegal. Like clear out the encampments, $10,000 or $15,000 for like being outside or whatever. Like it's a ridiculous plan. And then if you can't pay the fine, which you can't because you're unhoused,
You're
like you can't,
homeless.
if you pay the fine, you would have a home. Then they're just gonna put you in jail, which I I feel like I am
So
not an
expensive for the
accountant.
government.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not an accountant, but I think it would literally be cheaper to give everyone a house. Like, I actually think
It
that if
would.
we built like a little apartment for every single person in one of those encampments, it would be less money than just jailing them indefinitely. That's fucking crazy.
And cruel. And this is the thing, right? Is it's like jails, like at jails, you need to have wardens and guards, you right? You need to have like I don't know what the hierarchy of like prison jailers is, but it's like, you got the on the ground people, you got the people who you got like probably manager to whatever ratio, and like you're not allowed to have people be on shift by themselves. So think of it, we can think of public housing this way. Public housing is like a prison, but we don't have to pay prison guards. And
Yeah.
bonus, the people who live in public housing have privacy. They're not driven crazy by being in prison.
Yeah. They're also much less likely to violently assault each other because they're not being traumatized every day by a terrible system that they have no control over. And just to segue back briefly to your point about the government being a landlord, like private landlords don't use the money that they get from their properties to like build schools. Like that's like
Right.
the government is like objectively a better landlord because they're not just like leeching and like living paycheck to other person's paycheck. Like they
Right.
use that money to like reinvest in well, I mean, in theory, they use that money to reinvest in the community. They build and provide infrastructure and healthcare and other things that we need.
Yes, exactly. So it's like literally pays for itself many times over. It brings down the crime rate. Like there's so many benefits to public housing and
Yeah, well, I mean, just to keep talking about housing briefly, like I think one of the things that people forget about Doug Ford's time as premier is the literal first thing he did was like scrap rent control in Ontario. And in the time that he has been a landlord, or a landlord, I mean, he probably is a landlord, but in the time that he's been premier, the average rent has gone up like 190%. Like it's a ridiculous number. The average rent in the province used to be like $1,200 a month, and now it's like $2,900 a month. It's insane.
yeah, and
So
like Toronto is now I think almost as expensive to live in New York City as New York City. Um and like I don't love New York. I don't for our Torontonian listener base, it's might be sacrilege for me to say I also don't love Toronto. But like if I was had to pay New York rent, I would probably prefer to be in New York. Let's put it that way, you know?
that is a fair point. Hard disagree. But that's just me personally. I'm aggressively Torontonian. I also never feel fully clean when I'm in New York. Like that's like a real thing.
That's
That's my
fair.
my
That's
actual
fair.
genuine issue with New York is that like whenever I go there, no matter how many times I shower, I feel like the grime just like doesn't come off. But I do love New York. I don't want to talk shit about New York. I also like I think it's silly when people compare Toronto to New York because they're like fundamentally very different cities. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that you know I've been looking at the platforms of the other parties, and to me, like the NDP is talking about building public housing. The Green Party is talking about building public housing. The Liberals are talking about building affordable housing, but they've been not really clear about what affordable housing actually means, which I think is kind of a perennial thing with them, where they're just like, yeah, we're going to do the left wing thing. Totally, definitely. We're definitely going to do that. Uh, so, I mean, it remains to be seen what will actually get done, but what we know for sure is that Doug Ford's plan is to not build any housing and also arrest people for being homeless. So that's fun.
So what we're saying is call your uncle and like either try to get him to not vote at all or try to persuade him to vote for someone who's not Doug Ford.
Yeah, I would settle for, well, okay. Let's, before I say I would settle for Bonnie Crombie, what do you make of the Liberals taking this weird anti-immigration turn? Like, I don't know if you've, you know, caught on to this, but in a similar vein to like Doug Ford just making homelessness illegal, like I was reading the party platforms for the different parties this election, and only one of them is talking about immigration at all. Like even the conservatives haven't really touched this issue, but the liberals have proposed to cap international students at 10%, for like the international student enrollment in universities, like in post-secondary institutions, at 10% of the student body. And also like they earmarked some crazy number of millions of dollars to increase border security for some reason, like with the
What is
border.
happening?
And I'm like, this feels like, to me, it's like pre-consenting to fascism, if that makes sense. Like we're like, there's no, the fascism isn't even here yet, and they're already like, oh yeah, no, we'll do whatever you want. We're gonna cut immigration. There's too many Indians.
Like it's extremely strange for the Liberal Party to, be racist when historically throughout our lifetime, they are the ones who are supposedly the champions of multiculturalism. Um, and so like to me, that's a really good indication of I think like something else that I think is an interesting trend is like over time is I feel like with the rise of political consultants, there's so much more of a move for instead of parties to try to campaign on things that are persuasive based on an ideology. So like, like the NDP nominally has a socialist ideology depending on if your provincial or party kept the word socialist in its mandate, which
Right.
the federal one doesn't anymore. But
Uh,
well, we love socialism. Okay. And so, uh, so the idea is like behind a political party is that it's supposed to be like a party that has an ideology and then like builds policies that are informed by the ideology it stands for. And so, like, what, like, I'm sure some political consultant was like, well, this is the way the wind is blowing. And then the liberals, because they don't really have an ideology other than trying to be the middle of the road between the conservatives and the NDP, like, has for some reason decided that being anti immigrant is good politics in terms of trying to get elected. But, like, the other reason why this is hugely a shot in the foot is like, I don't know if you heard, but York University has announced that it's going to be canceling a bunch of its majors, I
yep.
think particularly humanities, and Canadian universities because both federally and provincially there hasn't been any significant increase in funding to post-secondary. It's either stayed the same or gone down. And like the thing that happens with inflation over time is if you're not raising the funding with at minimum the rate of inflation, then you're functionally cutting funding, right?
Correct.
So if
Yeah.
money is becoming less valuable over time and you keep dedicating the same amount of money, you're actually dedicating less money. And so this has been happening with a lot of our institutions. I know we're going to talk about healthcare soon. And so it's definitely one that happens with healthcare, but it also has happened with universities. And so the way that a lot of Canadian universities have been trying to cross subsidize is by increasing the number of international students. They put a 10% cap on international students is a death sentence for a lot of universities, unless there's also a stake in the liberal platform that says we will increase provincial funding to universities, which are funded both by provincial and federal governments. Um, unless they're also going to be increasing funding to provincial universities, if the Liberals somehow win the election, then like we will see a lot of universities in Ontario having to either massively decrease their offerings or maybe even close.
Yeah, I mean, they're. I believe they are also earmarking a little bit more funding to increase the funding for universities, but not as much as the either the NDP or the Green Party had said they would. The NDP is weirdly into French language education in Ontario. They're going to fund the Université de Sudbury, which I thought was kind of funny, but kind of cool. You know, I'm not inherently against more French universities in the province, but I do think, yeah, I mean, this right wing shift is perplexing for me. Like, I think that the point that you made about, you know, like the parties used to stand for something, like, I think that's a real, a real valid point that,
Problem.
like, well, it's a huge problem. And I think it's not just, you know, provincially, it's federally, it's internationally. Like, politicians have, for a while, I felt like have been just like reading the room of like what is popular. And I think that is how you end up with, you know, fascism effectively, because people, you can manufacture consent for whatever. And the idea that just because an idea is popular and just because a lot of people support it, that means that the government should do it. It's like, I mean, there's history is full of examples of the government doing awful shit that was very popular. And, you know,
Yes.
look, capping international students at 10% is not slavery. Like, it's there's definitely, you know, degrees here, but like it's still bad. And I mean, a thing that like I feel like is even more perplexing is like the conservatives have not mentioned immigration at all. Like, there's no specific immigration related anything in their platform. There's no specific policy proposals about it. They're not talking about it. So this is just the liberals are like, yeah, and also we don't like that there's Indian people. It's crazy to me that like they're just like they brought this up seemingly out of nowhere.
It's also like surely just alienating a huge portion of the electorate in Ontario, which are of South Asian descent, right? Like, do they forget that, like, or like, do they think that people who have like either dual citizenship of like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh,
Yeah,
etc., Sri Lanka, like, do they just think that those people are like, oh, like you hate people from where I'm from, but I'll vote for you anyway. Like, it's
the
pretty
liberal
way back.
MPP in my riding is South Asian, and I like desperately want to ask him like, hey man, like what do you think they're trying to deport your nephew? Like what the fuck? It's crazy to me. Like, look,
Well,
like
what's funny is that as Canadians, like they'd probably be like, well, at least they'll deport him to India and not to Panama, so we're still better than America.
that's true. That's true. I mean, I've mentioned that, you know, in a couple of previous episodes now, but like I think that like a hugely damaging part of our national identity is the way that like we only have to be like 2% better than the United States, because like that means that the worst that they get, like we have permission to get, you know,
Exactly.
just you know,
Worse
almost
too.
as bad. Like, and as long as we're just doing like, why is that the bar? Why is the bar like,
I
oh
know.
yeah,
Surely
they're
because
like cutting people up and feeding them into meat grinders. Like, we don't do that. We only do the firing squad. Like, that's insane. That's still so
right.
bad.
It's very bad.
Um, but yeah, I mean, on that topic, like on the topic of cutting people up and putting them in meat grinders, let's talk about healthcare. Um, you know, we love to talk about our healthcare in this country, particularly when we are talking to Americans. Oh my God, like you will
Yes.
never find a more smug person than a Canadian talking to an American who's like, oh, like, but I can go to the doctor and I don't have to pay money unless it's for my teeth or my eyes or my brain or, you know, any kind of pharmaceutical product that I might need, or any, you know, like
Yeah, so in Canada, you can get prescribed medication from a doctor and then go to the pharmacy and have to pay for the prescription. It doesn't make any sense. Like, if the doctor says you need the medication, why should you have to pay to fill the prescription?
it's ridiculous. I mean, I my favorite medical experience that I've had that perfectly exemplifies this is the years long saga that I tried to get my wisdom teeth removed, and I literally had to like wait until I was gainfully employed because the university health insurance that I had did not cover enough of it for my parents to afford it. So I got my wisdom teeth, even though I'd known that I had to get my wisdom teeth removed since I was like 15. I got my wisdom teeth removed at the last possible time that I could when I was 26 years old, because
Wow.
that's when I had insurance and I was able to pay for it. And I still had to pay like $2,000 out of pocket to get all four removed. Like it was crazy. Cause the with my copay, you know, and all the like with my insurance, it was still $500 a tooth. And then on the day of the operation, I get my wisdom teeth removed. I go to the pharmacy to pick up my painkillers. They scan the little card that my employer gives me for my health insurance, and the lady at the pharmacy was an older African, well, I guess she wasn't African American. She was an older Black lady. I don't really know where she was from, but she sounded African American, because what she said to me, and I'll remember it for the rest of my life, she scanned my card and she went, "Oh, baby, you got bad insurance." I was like, I know.
No.
And I had to pay for these drugs, and they covered like $10 of it, and it wasn't crazy expensive, but like I might as well have not used it at all. And that was like a perfect example of like, I was like, oh yeah, this is the universal healthcare that we have, where I'm out like grand for my fucking teeth, and then I still had to pay for my painkillers.
Oh my God.
But
Sorry. I'm just thinking about my experience of getting my wisdom teeth out. And like so for people who aren't aware, people who have the hair for red, the gene for red hair, often, it's more difficult to put us under
oh shit,
for anesthetic. Yeah. It's like a weird genetic anomaly. I don't think they understand like why or the how, but it's just it's a facts are facts situation. And
that's like
so
a
I'm just
very
imagine
inconvenient superpower. Like,
it is a very, yeah. So like when, for example, I had to get a root canal done when I was in South Africa, and the guy was like, if you need more freezing on the tooth, like put your hand up, and he like was like, if you shouldn't feel anything, so if you feel something, put your hand up, and I like he touched me, and I immediately felt it, so I put my
oh
hand
damn.
up, and he was like, oh, you need the rhino dose, which is like a very South Africanism,
I
but I
think
was
that's the
like.
most African way to describe that.
It truly was. It truly was. Yeah. So anyway, I so like, a lot of people have like funny stories about like when they're coming down like after anesthetic and stuff. And like I was kind of looking forward to hopefully having a funny story, and I was just miserable. And so I'm just imagining myself in your shoes and thinking about how like miserable I was. It was like April in Newfoundland, and I like spit up a bunch of blood in the snow in front of my parents' house, and so I'm just thinking about then hearing, "Oh, baby, you got bad insurance," Fuck.
Yeah. No, it was great. I took the subway despite them telling me that I definitely wasn't allowed to do that. I just like walked out. I know it's fine. But yeah, no, it was a whole thing. And I think that like, despite the fact that like I was fine and it's a funny story, I was out like a bunch of months. I was eating ramen that month, like,
Yep.
because at the time I wasn't making a ton of money. And it just to get like a necessary medical procedure, because my teeth were pushing all the other teeth out of my mouth. Like you need teeth.
You
Uh,
you need teeth. This is this is the thing, right? It's like orthopedic surgery, right? The surgery on bones. That's
yep.
covered because it's a surgeon. And like there's arbitrary medical history reasons as to why doctors are not the people who like operate on our teeth, right? And so literally it's like the Canadian government said, well, there's some arbitrary medical history that divides these two professions, and so we choose to pay one but not the other. Like it's so strange and arbitrary. Um and the other thing is like there's a reason why drugs in Canada are less expensive than they are in the United States, but not as inexpensive as they are in other countries. And it's because of our half-assed system, because in Canada, and this is one of the reasons why public healthcare systems are more efficient than private healthcare systems, is because they are things that need to be done at a really large scale, right? So in Canada, because there are provincial, like if you're on income support, you're most types of drugs, not all of them, but like most types of drugs are covered on a generic version by the provincial government. And so everyone in Canada benefits from the fact that there's a guarantee that provincial governments, who are in charge of the direct funding of healthcare or spending on healthcare, I should say, the federal government funds healthcare, the provincial governments administer it. And so there, because the provincial governments are guaranteed to buy a certain amount of each drug, that brings the price down the same way that when you go shopping at Costco, you're buying in bulk, you're saving money. And so what happens then, like I'm in America, and so I'm now on the other side of this. And so like in America, there's no bulk buying, right? Like there's all these different little supposedly things that are supposed to be competing against each other that don't compete well, right? In Europe, like in the UK, where there's like the NHS, like the UK is like, well, we have this many humans, this percent of them have diabetes. So we know that we're going to need this much insulin, right? And so they can get better deals because they are more streamlined in their administration. And so in America, there's no streamlining of administration. And to demonstrate like the levels of foolishness that this causes, I am a motor vehicle accident survivor. I have like relatively complex health needs for someone of my age. I'm 31. And so I had to go to here in America, there's something called a walk-in orthopedic clinic, which is weird, but okay.
What?
Because in Canada, yeah, in Canada, the orthopedic surgeons are specialists, and so you need to have a referral to go see them, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, America's weird. This is one of the weird things. And so I'm at this like urgent care for orthopedics. And I was like, in a lot of pain, so I was crying, and I guess that's probably why they didn't ask me to pay my copay, because every time I go to the doctor here, I have to pay $10. Okay, and so I didn't ask me to pay my $10, even after I'd seen the doctor, I'd stopped crying, blah blah blah. They didn't, and so they started sending me bills in the mail. And I have ADHD, and so like doing tasks in general can be the struggle bus, and doing those kinds of administrative tasks is extra taxing. And so I haven't paid the bill, and they've like mailed me about it for almost a year now, which means they've probably, and it's $10 copay. So they could have spent more money on printing and postage to try to retrieve $10 from me than my $10, right? And so this is an example of like why having private healthcare systems like don't the competition mechanism that is used in other parts of capitalism doesn't work very well in medicine.
Yeah, I mean it's one of the many reasons. Like every insurance company is a corporation, right? Like every single one of those
Yes,
people,
every one of
they
them.
yeah, they employ, and it's not just the people who do the insurance part of it. There's, like that every one of those companies has an HR department. They have CEOs, they get paid a bunch of money, which we all, we've heard about that. Like they, there's
They
the
own
guy who's
buildings.
yeah,
They
they own
own or rent
buildings,
buildings, janitors, like executive assistants, like,
yeah,
bonuses for
team dinners, they
whatever.
got,
Like,
fucking like all those like,
yeah,
whatever
like
initiatives
weekend
they have to do,
retreat.
like corporate social responsibility, all that stuff costs money that if there were a single payer, maybe the person who works in the federal office might, there might be an HR department there, but that's one HR department, not seven. And so the consumers aren't paying for like multiple different, discrete apparatuses to support something that really only needed one. Uh, we, we, we,
Exactly. And like,
we think about it as like a much more efficient, well, we don't think like people think about it as a much more efficient system, but that's inherently a fallacy. Like it's just not more efficient. There's a huge amount of waste in a privatized system as well. We just don't talk about it that way.
exactly. And like, this is also important to think about in the context of like past policies of the Ford government in Ontario, right? Because but Doug Ford has opened the door to privatization within the Ontario healthcare model. So, right now it's under a limited scope. It's for things like MRIs, but, it still means that there are now these corporations that are competing for jobs for nurses, right? So, like, if nurses can get paid um, more in the private sector, or there are other ways too. Like, I know in Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, like the nursing, like right now, it's not like you can't work part-time as a nurse in the
Right.
public system in Newfoundland and Labrador, like for whatever, there's like, some politicking reasons as to why it's not true. And so then it means like, so if you could work part-time as a nurse at like an MRI clinic that's private, then that's someone who might say, oh, well, if I work in the public system, I have to work part-time or full-time, but I'd rather work part-time for various reasons. So I'm going to quit this public job and instead, work at this private clinic. And the other thing too is like there's not a lot of protections in terms of regulations. So things like they pay these clinics flat fees. So they pay $300, about, it's a little less, but it's around $300 an hour to operate the MRI machine. And like that company has to pay for the building. They have to pay for the nurses' salaries. They have to pay for the receptionist salaries. They might want to have an on-staff doctor in case like something goes sideways, and so like $300 an hour per MRI is like not actually a lot of money. And so they probably are going to try to find other ways to charge patients to try to make up the difference and or like actually start making profits and stuff. And so what happens is like in Canada, we haven't seen a significant increase in healthcare funding during our whole lifetime. And that means that the amount that Canadian healthcare's been funded has actually gone down significantly because of what we talked about earlier about inflation, right? Like you and I are experiencing kind of like the first inflation crisis of our lifetime, but it's not the first inflation crisis of our parents' lifetime. And so that means that there's like, been at least two or three shocks in like the last like, 60 years that have caused the like value of money to go down. And so they're like, that's the sneaky way that they are now have decreased funding to the healthcare system, even if they're not actively axing funding to the healthcare system. And then, that means that like we talked about elitism. And so, the elites are the ones who want healthcare to be privatized because it gives them a new opportunity to invest in something, like a new field of investment that wasn't previously possible for them in Canada. And so to me, it's like we really, especially, given that we're also likely going to be going into a federal election soon. And that's also probably one of the reasons why Ford called this election because, there's like a common saying that if there's liberals in Ottawa, then there'll be conservatives at Queen's Park or vice versa. And
Yeah.
so, like, he's calling this election because he wants to stay in power. Like, this is a power grab by him. And so we have to defend our public institutions in Canada because I'm in America right now. I'm recording from Minneapolis. And so I'm in a sane state, but like I know people who work for the federal government who are afraid to lose, who are afraid of losing their job, who are, getting executive orders about, protecting women from gender ideology, among other things. Right. And so, we have to start like you said about we need to start holding ourselves to a higher standard. Like it shouldn't just be that we can be proud of ourselves for the fact that people who have diabetes don't have to like pay out of pocket for insulin now, question mark, maybe. Like I don't really call that pharmacare, but like hot take from the liberals in Ottawa for sure. But like we should be demanding more public services, right? So like capitalism and like the manufacturing consent of the conservatives is like on healthcare has been a slow burn because they realized they couldn't axe funding to healthcare because that would be very unpopular. But if
Yeah.
they just don't increase funding to healthcare, they realize that they're functionally doing the same thing. And so they can kind of get away with not having to do the unpopular thing of cutting healthcare, but like still to their ultimate goal, which is to like allow private interests into the healthcare system so that their buddies and themselves can profit from it in one way or another.
Yeah, and just to expand on that a little bit, like it's not just that they haven't increased funding and so they're effectively cutting funding. It's also, I mean, this kind of ties into like the enshittification of everything. I love that term, but that we see in other, more private services. I mean, this is a thing that they talk about in tech often. But in the healthcare context, like it's pretty clear that services, because the funding hasn't increased, and obviously that means that effectively the funding has decreased, services have gotten less good, less comprehensive, less efficient. Interacting with the healthcare system in any way has gotten just like less enjoyable. It's just become more tedious. It's hard to find like I'm in between doctors right now. I signed up for like the Ontario, there's like a program called Healthcare Connect that matches you with a doctor who's taking patients. I've been waiting to hear from them for months. Like I haven't heard from them at all. It's every aspect of the healthcare system is becoming increasingly difficult to interact with. And I think that that's deliberate. It's a deliberate strategy, because if you make interacting with the public healthcare system shitty, people will want to privatize it. And you already hear that, like anecdotally. I'm in conversations with people all the time where they're like, well, maybe, like the public healthcare system is so shitty. Like you got to wait so long. Maybe the private healthcare system wouldn't be so bad. And I have to point out to them, like, have you, like, they're literally shooting people in the streets in America because of how bad their healthcare system is. Like, I know that's kind of like a little bit of an oversimplification of the issue, but like Free Luigi, man, like he killed a guy and everyone loved it. Like the public en masse fully supported him. That's indicative of a problem in the United States. And it's crazy to me that we have people in Canada who are like, yeah, no, totally, we should try the system that led to that. Like, that's exactly what we want here, is for that to happen like 20 years down the line. So yeah, I mean, I think that, like, in addition to it just being a way to, well, I mean, it's both things. It's a way to privatize it so that, elites can make money off of it. But the kind of cutting of the cutting without cutting is also a way to just like create friction in the system so that they can manufacture consent for these cuts. And I think you're 100% right. Like, we need to insist on not just maintaining the system, but expanding it, and so that it's actually universal, and so that it's properly funded and good for everyone.
Like, a mutual friend of ours once said to me, when interacting with the U.S. government, that they understood why Americans hate the government so much, because every point of contact Americans have with the government is horrible. It's like getting your social security number, Medicaid, Medicare, all these systems that are like notoriously difficult to navigate, like the DMV, and like in Canada, at least the government does give us stuff, right? Like our healthcare, like you said,
Yes.
we need to hold ourselves to higher standards, but like at least in Canada, we do have a better sense of like the possibility of government, And so I would really encourage people to like talk to older people in your household about what healthcare used to be like. Like, what changes in healthcare have you noticed over your lifetime? And then we can attribute those changes and the downward trend in the efficiency of our healthcare system to the lack of funding. That doesn't mean it should be privatized. It means it should be funded correctly.
Yeah, I mean, and just to, like, you're talking about the DMV. I mean, we're going to keep talking about healthcare, but I just want to say something really quick about the DMV. Like, the worst aspect of interacting with the Canadian government is Drive Test, and Drive Test is not a government agency. Drive Test is a private company that, like, that's who gives us driver's licenses in Ontario. It's been privatized, and dealing with them is a nightmare. It's unbelievably unpleasant. So, I mean, if you want healthcare to be like Drive Test, then, vote for privatization. Otherwise, don't. But, let's just to build on that. Like, I want to talk a little bit about, the parties that are actually proposing to expand healthcare. And also the one party, well, I mean, there are two parties that really are. The Conservatives are proposing $1.4 billion in new funding for a $1.8 billion plan to connect, by creating 300 primary care teams, which seems like an insane amount of money to create 300 primary care teams. Like, I'm wondering where this $1.8 billion is going. The Liberals are guaranteeing every Ontarian will have a family doctor close to them by the end of their first term. They're planning to invest $3.1 billion to attract and retain 3,100 family doctors by 2029, which sounds good. They're going to double medical school spots. That sounds pretty good to me. Integrating internationally trained doctors more quickly, which I think this is the one area where every party except for the conservatives is doing pretty good work by like recognizing that we have a huge number of like internationally trained doctors who are driving fucking Ubers right now. That
Yeah.
that has been a thing that has driven me crazy my entire life. Like it's not like, you know, like the Iraqi human body is different than the Canadian human. Like you're a doctor. They're not, you know, okay, maybe there's some technology that we have that they might not have been exposed to. You can teach them how to use the fucking machine. Like it's
Yeah.
not.
They have a medical degree. They can figure it out.
Yeah, I was about to say it's not rocket science. It's actually like objectively probably harder than rocket science. But you know, they're investing all this money in trying to hire more doctors, make it easier to become a doctor. One thing that I'm not so invested in is the part of the plan that says that those doctors would have technology such as AI and eliminating fax machines to more efficiently do paperwork. I hate when we just throw AI and shit. I also definitely don't want our medical records going into it. That sounds terrible.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why fax machines are still used in medicine is because they're unhackable.
Yeah. And they could be part of care teams that work evenings and weekends. So we're also going to make them work evenings and weekends. Which, okay, you know what? I'm actually kind of on board for that because I don't work evenings and weekends. I work during the week. So if the doctor is also working during, like, I actually do think that probably some doctors should have to work evenings and weekends. Like, I'm sorry, doctors, but if I were a doctor, I would not want to work evenings and weekends. But like, I also need to go to the doctor, and I can't sometimes just like leave work to go to the doctor. So I initially was not in favor of that, but as I was thinking about it, I was like, no, actually, I would use that. That's something that I think that like a lot of people who are in regular work hours like just struggle to get to the doctor because you can't always leave your job just to like go to a medical appointment for 3 hours. They're going to increase pay for nurses. That's pretty good. Annual home care funding would get a 25% increase. That's pretty good. They would bring universal mental health care, which is a thing that all three parties besides the progressive conservatives are proposing, which is interesting to me. They offer wide-ranging addiction support, which I think is good. They are the only non-conservative party that is not suggesting to either bring back or expand safe injection sites, which I think is probably a failure. But at least they're trying to address the issue in some substantive way besides just like putting people in jail. And they're also going to build a new hospital in Kitchener-Waterloo. Other than the AI plan, I genuinely think that's an okay plan. If the liberals were to come to power, apart from selling all of our data to probably Meta or, you know, maybe Twitter or some other horrible, you know, open AI, some fucked up, maybe they'll use DeepSeek and it'll just be the Chinese government, which honestly I'm actually more down for than Elon. If they use the Chinese one.
They've got good medicine over there.
They do. Yeah, I mean the NDP, they have a similar plan. They're going to bring in an extra 400 doctors, 3,500 new doctors, reduce medical paperwork, make it easier for, you know, internationally trained doctors to, you know, work in Ontario. The main difference between the NDP plan and the Liberal plan, as well as the Green Party plan, is the NDP plan is going to reopen closed safe injection sites. The Green Party is planning to build even more. And the Green Party is also the only party that is vowing to completely outlaw like for-profit healthcare in the province, which I think, you know, ideally, you know, in an ideal world, that's what I'd like to see is just no for-profit healthcare of any kind in the province and fully publicly funded healthcare. So, you know, I want to talk about two of those things. I want to talk about, first, let's talk about a little bit about universal mental health care, because I think that's really important. I would love some universal mental health care. I do sort of think maybe we could get eyes and teeth done first, but if we're going to, you know, I'll take whatever, you know, they're going to, if we're going to do, you know, mental health first, I'm totally down for that. I'm very happy to get my free therapy, provided that it's good.
Well, I mean, that's like one of the things I find really interesting about this idea of universal mental health care is I have an acquaintance who is currently in school to become a therapist, but like, you know, even within the same program as this person, like one of the things they do is like they'll do consults, and sometimes like the same different people will do consults with the same person, and then they like come back and they kind of like compare notes with like the people mentoring them and stuff. And like my friend's like experience was oh my God, like one of my colleagues, like I just don't understand how they're going to help people like when they actually finish this program. And like they're not a badly intentioned person, and like they're probably they're getting passing grades, like they're not causing harm, but like they're not necessarily helping either. And so like I think like regimes of mental health are like so different, like finding a therapist who works for you, et cetera, et cetera. Like, the struggle bus is real. And then like some people are like, like too scared to like fire their therapist and try to find a new one and blah, blah, blah. And so it's like, I don't know, it strikes me as like a bit like difficult. And obviously it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do things. We should do hard things. We should do hard things. But I also think sometimes like these kind of mental health care situation things can be a bit of a cop out for some of these other more material concerns that we've talked about. So for example, like I see this a lot in the North. I see it acutely in the North, which means that I think it's probably somewhat true in the South as well. So like people in the North are like, oh, mental health is really important. And I'm like, it is really important. You know what else is important? People not living in overcrowded houses. Like, it's pretty depressing to live in an overcrowded house. So, like, if everyone had their own house, how would people's mental health respond to that, right? So it's like if people can afford, if a house in Toronto didn't cost $5,000 a month to rent, like, people would probably be less stressed. If they were less stressed, they might not be anxious or depressed, right? So, there are these ways where it's like you said about teeth and medicine, right? Like, I think those are probably things that should be prioritized. And I also think it's like if we had a more robust and secure and like holistic social safety net, then we had better, Canada has a much higher rate of unionization than the United States, but like most private sector work in Canada is not unionized. Whereas like in Iceland, for example, it's law for everyone to be a member of a union.
Yeah.
And so, I also wonder about like these other ways that other forms of social policy that could contribute to our overall well-being by like just improving our overall standards of living. Like I don't know much about like what the mental health situation and conversations in places like Iceland are. But I feel like if I was part of a union and like had good working hours and like could afford to like rent a nice place and, could eat nice organic food, I'd probably be happier than I am now.
That's a great point. And I also think that like, I mean, I said free therapy and, you immediately were like, yeah, free therapy. That's great. But actually, like, you make a really good point, which is that, like, who knows what does universal mental health care even mean, right? Like, is that, like, weird conversion therapy to teach kids not to be trans? Like, there's
Right.
somebody who thinks that's mental health care. Like, what is that actually, it's like dental care is clear. We know what dental care is. It's fucking fixing people's teeth. But universal mental health care is up for a lot of interpretation. And maybe it's therapy, maybe it's giving people drugs, like maybe that's it. Maybe it's just like you see a guy and you're like, oh, I'm depressed. And then he gives you Zoloft or whatever. And, without really, maybe there's a follow-up, maybe there's not a follow-up, but that might work for some people, but it's not going to work for everybody. If it's a government assigned therapist, can you fire them? Like if you don't vibe, like if their beliefs don't, match up with you. Like I pay a therapist privately. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that. And I've been seeing her for a number of years now, and we have a really good working relationship. I got really lucky. If I hadn't found a therapist that worked for me, I would have had the luxury to be able to find another therapist. But if that therapist were assigned to me by the government, maybe the government isn't super into letting people, fire their therapist, because you can't, I mean, you can in theory fire your doctor right now, but it's not as easy as just saying like, oh, I want to find another doctor.
Because like you said, like you've been waiting for months. So especially like if you're someone who has like health needs where you need to see your doctor, like, let's say once a month or once every 6 weeks or even once every 2 months, like if you have like a need, then like you can't just fire your doctor and get a new one now because of like the demand system, And like I was just also thinking about, there's a very popular book that's called The Body Keeps the Score. If you haven't read it, you've probably seen like the Instagram cliff notes for it. But one of the parts of that book that I think doesn't get enough attention is that the author, Bessel van der Kolk, he talks about basically how childhood abuse is one of the largest forms of like causing mental health issues later in life, like trauma from when we're children, right? And so that's why things like, Head Start in the US being canned by Musk is such a huge deal, right? Because Head Start, gives children an opportunity to like, make bonds with adults. Like if their home isn't like the safest place for them, it means that they do have places that they go where they look forward to going to and those kinds of things, right? Which is another kind of point for like, it's like, yeah, like, sure, maybe we do need we do need much better mental health integration in the Canadian healthcare system than we currently have. But like, we also should probably be making like things like in Newfoundland, for example, there's no pre-K. It's just kindergarten, right? And so like,
Yeah.
we should probably be investing more in like early childhood interventions and things so that people don't need as much mental health care as they grow older, because like there's a lot of concrete research that shows that those kind of early interventions are really important to preventing the need for like more acute care later in life.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably much easier to prevent people from becoming acutely depressed and anxious than it is to treat people once they already are. That's an anecdotal thing. Maybe it's not true, but I suspect that like a lot of the material, causes or a lot of the things that end up leading to, at least circumstantial depression and circumstantial, bouts of anxiety, like you're right. Like those are material realities. If your life sucks, you're much more likely to be depressed than if you're otherwise living like a happy and healthy existence. Like obviously there are people who have, mental health issues that go beyond like, like I was pretty depressed in university. My life was fine. But like, I think that there's a lot of people who like are just poor. Their life just sucks
Yeah.
because they don't have money and they don't get to do fun stuff. And a lot of their problems would be solved by like alleviating some of the burdens of their daily existence and allowing them to do some fun stuff. Like
Literally, and so this is the thing like if you like, and the other thing is that is actually normal, right? So like if your life sucks and you're depressed, that makes sense, right? Like
yeah,
that is logical. It makes sense, right? Like so having like so like let's say even in let's say like all of the everyone in Ontario has a primary care physician, but like there's no investment in other forms of public spending like social housing, then it still means like, people are going to be showing up to their doctors being like, yeah, I'm really poor. My life sucks. And then the doctor's like, want to try Zoloft? And they're like, okay. And then they
yeah,
go, like, they take Zoloft, they feel numb. And it's like, I guess maybe that's better than feeling actively depressed, question mark. And so it's like, this is the thing is I think like both you and I as like lefties, like I think what unites lefties is like as much as you described yourself as a pessimist earlier, is that like we have a certain optimism that a better world is possible, right?
yeah,
And so it's like, we might not always agree on like the paths to get there, but what's important is like thinking about like the conditions we're in now and like, you know, is it like we shouldn't be expecting people to like numb themselves to have to get through their lives? Like we only get one. We should be able to like enjoy it. Like it should be fun
yeah.
and like have whimsy and like, you know, things like the kind of criticism of impoverished people where it's like, oh, you didn't buy all no-name products. Well, gosh, you're not saving your pennies. And it's like, yeah, like people work minimum wage and like they want to feel nice sometimes. Like, so like we shouldn't shame them for wanting to like buy Nikes or like something for
Yeah.
themselves every now and then, right? Like those aren't
God
the
forbid
tipping
they
points.
experience joy. Like,
Right. Like those aren't the tipping points of whether or not people are going to get out of poverty when it costs $5,000 to rent a house,
yeah. And honestly, even if it was, like, that's an indictment of that system, not an indictment of the
Exactly, not the
people.
person.
Like,
Totally.
yeah. I mean, I think like, look, even if it's not possible to get to that better world, like, why wouldn't we try? That's the thing that frustrates me so much. Is like people who are just like, yeah, even if it were impossible, like, wouldn't you at least want to try? And then maybe if we get like 60% of the way there, that's still fucking better, Like that's still, even if we don't get to utopia, like we could get to like Utopia Light. I would love Utopia Light. We're not even in like diet utopia right now. We're in like actual terrible fascism. Like how is this even a conversation that like, yeah, well, what if we just gave up? Like, it's crazy to me that that's a part of it. But yeah, I think that like addressing, people's material conditions would go a long way. And even like if I look at my own life, like the ways in which therapy really helped me at the points at which my life sucked were my therapist acknowledging, yeah, your life is really shitty right now. Like that in itself is helpful to people. And yeah, maybe that would be addressed by, universal mental health care, but like I wouldn't have needed that if my life weren't shitty at that point in time. And like, some of the things that, people face challenges in life in general that like some of them are able to be mitigated by, their material conditions. Some of them aren't. Like life is hard sometimes, but like if there was a more robust social safety net, like even the things that aren't, controllable, like, say you have a parent who passes away, like that's a thing that, probably most people are going to experience in their lifetime. It would be better if you weren't like crushed by the expense of that. That wasn't a thing that's happened to me, by the way, but like, you know, it would be better if you weren't crushed by the expense of that. If there was some sort of social program that, and I know this doesn't exist almost anywhere, but like if there was some sort of program where like you didn't have to pay $10,000 to bury somebody,
Right, because
like that.
everybody dies. Like that's
Yeah,
also just like a fact.
yeah. That I think, I'm sure that is a cause of a lot of acute stress and depression and anxiety, because it's like at the hardest point in someone's life where they like lose one of the most important people, the dearest people to them. Then they're like, oh, fuck, I have to pay this like $20,000 bill. I don't have $20,000 just lying around. There's tons of ways in which this could be addressed, outside of just the universal mental health care. So I think that's a really good point. Like universal mental health care is, great in theory, maybe less great in practice. It remains to be seen if we even elect a party who actually attempts to do it, because I don't believe that even if the liberals win, they would actually do that. They say they're going to do it, but sure, I'll believe when I see it. But on that note, how do you feel about the Green Party? Because I feel like they're the only ones who actually actively promised universal health care this election. And I'm of two minds about the Green Party, because I reading these platforms to do research for this episode, like I earnestly found myself mostly more aligned with them even than the NDP. But I also feel like in the same way that like the federally, like they're not going to win. Like, and like maybe the NDP is not going to win either, but like they just aren't. Like their support is so marginal, and I think they're not different enough from the NDP in significant enough ways for me to feel justified in voting for them. But I'm interested to get your take, because I don't know. I feel like we're, politically fairly aligned, and I think that it's at least a conversation that's worth having.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I think it's interesting to think about situations where NDP green showdowns are like where people would choose, like we were talking, like where people would choose to vote green over NDP, for example, like on a candidate by candidate basis. And so I'm thinking about situations where like if the NDP candidate like wasn't well liked, like in the community where
Right.
they were running, for example. I think the other thing too is like that the Greens can kind of exist as like a check on the NDP. So like you were saying about how they're the only party that have actively endorsed truly universal healthcare in Ontario, and so like banning private healthcare. So I think like one thing that's useful is like for people who are Ontario voters, and who are more left-leaning, is to ask their NDP MPP candidate, hey, why didn't the NDP say that they're going to ban private healthcare? Because the Green Party did, And so I think that even though I haven't voted for the Green Party before myself, that there is within the Canadian system, there is a role for them to play in that sense. Because we referenced earlier that the NDP federally have taken socialist out of their mandate, right? Out of their party constitution, And so I don't think the Green Party have it in their constitution necessarily. But the point being is that they're the ones who are that's a socialist policy to say that they're going to ban any private healthcare. And so, the NDP in Canada, I think, have lost their way because they've been, they're drinking the same Kool-Aid as the other parties. They might not be hiring the same political consultants, but they're still hiring political consultants who are grown from the same vat as the other ones. And so I think that they're also been moving to the center when actually what they need to do is just spend time campaigning to win people to the left, because the left has just lost so much ground to the way that consent's been manufactured for these right-wing policies and these groundworks. And also the way that a lot of the groundwork for Silicon Valley has been making a lot of moves in American politics for the last 20 years. So it's not as much as for a lot of people, it feels like some of this Musk stuff is popping up out of nowhere. You can actually follow the trail of money back to, people like Bill Gates even. And so, it's also with the NDP, sometimes it feels a bit like we're running from election to election instead of having kind of these longer visions, right? Where you can trace the line between things like the Tea Party and Donald Trump, right? And the Tea Party was a thing that we used to joke around about when we were growing up, as kids. I'm sure we didn't know each other as children, but I'm sure both of us were making similar jokes, honestly.
Yeah.
And yet now those are the kind of people who are literally in charge of the United States of America. And so I'm at least thankful for the Green Party for standing up for actual lefty values in this context.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that, as voters and as people who experience, the system from only that side of it, we kind of lose sight of the value of just standing for something. That's because we're the consumer in effect. They're marketing towards us. But that's a really good point, because I think that, to your point earlier, all of these parties have kind of started to, except for maybe the Green Party, have started to pander to what they think is going to win them elections, rather than trying to convince people to actually believe in the things that they believe in. And I think that's a huge problem. At the point at which you start doing that is the point that you've lost the plot, because what even are you about as a political party if you don't actually have an ideology and you're just trying to pander to what you think people will like? People will like what you get them to like. The whole point of this is that you're supposed to be selling them on your ideas, not selling their own ideas to them.
Yes, exactly. And so that's the thing, is I think a lot of and that also comes around to capital, basically also not that politics wasn't capitalist before, but the further integration of ideas of capitalism in terms of things like monetary compensation and that kind of stuff, so there's this whole the industry of political consultants has to sell itself to politicians. And so they have to make themselves sound useful and helpful, and it's there are lines between the Democratic Party and the Liberal Party and the Republican Party and the Conservative Party. Those guys do draw from the same consultants. Sometimes it's you choose a brand and then you're oh, there's pluses and minuses to all the brands, And so, but it can be that, like, that can't be it. And so I think it's really important for us as voters to, like, use the tools we have at hand. And like one of those is threatening to vote for other parties. And
Yeah.
so like it's important for us to like stay engaged with people who are campaigning, and like they bring those back up their telephone lines. And also to remind people that like elections are just one part of democracy. And so doing things like organizing around campaigns around specific issues to different levels of government, running for things like school board, paying attention like for in provinces in Canada that have school board elections, not all of them do. And like contacting administrators within public services, like we're allowed to do that as citizens. And so I
Yeah.
think it's really important for people to remember that like as much as like elections are important and like there's stuff at stake, and to talk to your friends, to talk to your family, even if it's like difficult and unpleasant sometimes. My advice is, you know we don't win arguments the way that like it looks in like movies, like in the courtroom where there's like the lawyer cross-examining the witness and the witness breaks down. It's like, I did it, you win. Like that doesn't happen. There's an elder who used to work with McGill a lot when I was working with Indigenous studies there, and named Charlie Patton. And when he was renaming the Indigenous Health Practitioners Program, which is this kind of mentorship program to help expose Indigenous youth to different kinds of career in healthcare. So like not just being a doctor, but like what's physiotherapy, what's occupational therapy, like what is mental health therapy,
Right.
what like being like a radiation tech, or any like all the different kinds of careers that exist in health. And so he said, it's in Mohawk, but in English, what it translates to as to plant a seed in their mind. And so he said, you can't just walk into a classroom and point at people, be like, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a nurse, you're going to be an occupational therapist. What you have to do is you plant the seed in their mind and you water it, and, hopefully something grows. And so I think like when we think about the political conversations that we have with our family members, like it's really good to like personalize things, to talk about your feelings, because that like works on people.
Yeah.
And to like talk about how it relates to you or people and how it affects them. And hopefully those kinds of anecdotes and stories help plant those seeds. So it's like, even in this election cycle, you didn't get your parents to change their vote to a party that you think aligns better with maybe the whole family's values or your values specifically. That that doesn't mean you stop having the conversation until it's election time again. Like keep up those conversations. They're really important. They do change people's minds over time, and so that it feels like a sprint right now because that's what elections are, but we also have we keep running a marathon when it's over.
Yeah, I love that planting seeds in their mind metaphor. I think that's really cool. And I am definitely going to look up the word because I also think it's super cool that Mohawk has a word for that. Yeah, no, that's actually also like a good segue into, I think probably this will be the last thing that we talk about, which is strategic voting. How do you feel about strategic voting? Because I have thoughts, and my thoughts are mainly that very often I feel like strategic voting is used as kind of a cudgel by like centrists to get people who are further left of them to vote for centrist candidates that they don't necessarily agree with, even on anything, just to avoid having like a right-wing ghoul elected who is gonna do even more odious things than the centrists would have otherwise done. But yeah, I'm interested to hear your take as well, because I don't know, I feel like that's there's people who are for it, there are people who are against it. I find it annoying, but I understand why people advocate for it.
I think this is one of the mechanisms that keeps Canada back, or like keeps it in such a middle of the road position, because it's like, it's always like the threat of like it could be something worse.
Yeah,
And
that's
and
exactly
so
how I feel.
yeah, and I think like and so when it comes to like strategic voting, I really recommend people to like, I think it depends so much on where you are, because for example, like there's lots of reasons. There's like a really interesting riding in Regina where like the NDP candidate was like hands down beating the Liberal candidate. Like the Conservative candidate was in the lead, but the next closest candidate that was relatively close was an NDP candidate, right? And so like strategic voting doesn't always mean voting for the Liberals. Like it really does, like it matters in terms of especially in like if you're in a more rural area, like the likability of candidates is really important, for example. Or if you have family members who are in more rural areas, like reaching out to them and talking, because like in Canada, just because of the way our election system works, like it is seats, people who vote in rural areas have like their votes are more heavily weighted, like proportionally, because to get elected in downtown Toronto, like the riding might be like 250,000 people versus like in Thunder Bay, there's probably only a couple seats there, right?
Right.
And so that means that people in Thunder Bay's votes kind of quote unquote count for more. And so then, it's important also for people who live in more urban parts of the province to like be having conversations about like with their family members in more rural areas, because those seats can get some really interesting results sometimes because of that. So that's like, I think another thing to kind of like look out for when it comes to strategic voting is that it doesn't always mean voting for the Liberals. Like sometimes like the NDP candidate actually is the more competitive candidate.
That's a really good point. I do think that's a fair point. I am generally of the mind myself that like the idea of democracy is to vote your conscience, but I also kind of understand, or at least your values, if not your conscience. But I do understand that like, there is a strategy here. There's a political necessity here. And like, sometimes it is better to not have the right wing ghoul elected, even if that means you got to hold your nose and vote for someone you don't necessarily agree with. And that, often that is, the left wing candidate or the left wing person, voting for a centrist. But I would say that you're right. Like, I think that if the shoe's on the other foot, then we should be encouraging people who are more centrist to vote, left of them, which I think the source of my frustration is that often doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But
and so that's the thing is like, I would say it definitely is like kind of more rare, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And like, we need to, like, I think it's important for like, if like even talking when, if strategic voting comes up, right? Like something that maybe people can take from our conversation about this topic today is like, when strategic voting comes up, to like remind people that like there are cases where voting further left is sometimes the actual strategy.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that is a thing that I fully endorse. And if you are a person who's listening to this who is, maybe a little bit more centrist in your inclinations, although I feel like if you've made it to episode 4 and you're not like losing your mind, you're probably far enough left that this doesn't apply to you. But maybe you know me personally, you like me, and you're holding your nose through all of my insane lefty opinions. But if that is you, and you happen to be in a riding where the NDP candidate is either in the lead or trailing in a small amount behind the Conservative, I would encourage you to hold your nose and vote for them. I think that would be what's best for the province. I think that's what would be the best for people in general. But yeah, I think that is what people should do. And then, yeah, I think that covers everything that I wanted to talk about. I will do one more thing, which is, so here on the Bad Eye podcast, I have been recommending people pieces of media. I did not tell you that we were going to do this, so if you don't have one, that's fine. But if you've got like a cool thing that you have been enjoying lately, like a book or a movie or a poem or a song or whatever it is, feel free to plug it. And if not, I will think of one.
Okay, I got a couple ones for you. So, for people who might not be aware, there is a show set in Nunavut that has come out on CBC and APTN called North of North, and the people are loving it. Inuit love it, non-Inuit love it. It is hilarious. highly recommend. I guarantee you will laugh out loud if you watch that show. Um, I also want to shout out a true classic, which is I am currently re-listening to the audiobook of Dracula, which is one of my favorite novels. And I think it has a lot of resonance for the present time because it's about, changes in technology during the end of the 19th century and like anxiety around them. The word voluptuous comes up a lot more times than I would maybe want in an ideal world, um, but yeah, it's like the writing's good and there's like mystery and, like even if you've seen films based on Dracula or films that, dance in the mythology of Van Helsing, the original novel, you can never, it's quite good. And then,
Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's
yeah, the OG,
okay.
the
Awesome.
Dracula. Yeah, yeah. And then finally, I would recommend the podcast Material Girls, which is a kind of like culture podcast that brings in some critical theory with these two women who both have PhDs from the University of Alberta. They originally ran a podcast together called Witch Please, which was a feminist close reading of Harry Potter, where they threw out the rules that J.K. Rowling tried to set on the series. And so those are the things bringing me joy at the moment. So
Did those rules include changing the fact that every person of color in that entire series has an alliterative name? Because that drove me fucking nuts as a kid.
yo, I only realized that right now. The exception
Parvati
is
Patel, Cho Chang.
no, but the black people get to not be alliterations because
That's true.
Dean
That's
Thomas
true.
and
But is
Angela,
Dean
I forget
Thomas
what her
black
last
in
name
the
is.
book? I don't remember if he's black in the. I think that might have they just cast a black actor.
Yeah, I think he just cast him. That's fair. That's fair. And what about you?
So my recommendation for the week is going to be the Situation Room podcast by Francesca Fiorentini. She's another lefty podcaster. She's American, so she does American politics. But if you're looking for someone who's covering the kind of Trump, Elon, MAGA coup that's happening right now in a way that's like both, really brave leftist political analysis that like doesn't throw any marginalized communities under the bus and is like really, willing to stand up for the rights of everybody, the rights of trans people, undocumented people, immigrants in general, in like in an affirmative and a positive way, rather than just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess they deserve rights too. But like really centering that at the core of her politics. Like I highly recommend you check her out. She's also a comedian by trade, so she's incredibly funny. But yeah, that's one of my favorite podcasts. I listen to it, every new episode that comes out. And if you're into what I'm doing here at all, I would really highly recommend that you check her out because she's doing it way better than I am. So I want to say a big thank you. It's been great talking to you. This is the longest recording I've done by like 3 times. So I'm going to pare it down into what I hope is going to be a listenable episode. But I want to thank you for your time and for being so generous with your thoughts and your opinions. It's been a real pleasure. And hopefully you are interested in coming back soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds fun. It's been great chatting with you, and hopefully people have some new fodder for their argument with their racist uncle.
Yes, always argue with your racist uncles. We fully support that at the Bad Eye Podcast. That's it for episode 4. If you made it this far, I want to give another huge thank you to Patricia. You will be hearing more of her because we yapped for like 3 hours, and I'm pretty sure I can cut a whole other episode out of the rest of this conversation, which I probably will be doing because I'd really hate for you guys to miss out on some of the other cool stuff we talked about. I also want to say thank you for listening. I know I said it would be dropping on time this week, but we had some personal stuff come up that forced us to delay again. So I appreciate your patience, and I hope that the extra long episode makes up for the delay. As always, a final thank you to Sazjaz Paris for allowing us to use his sick tunes. And I hope that we gave you some information that was helpful to you in thinking about who you're going to vote for and why you should be voting. If you haven't already, polls are already open when this drops and will be open until the 27th. Please do go vote, and don't vote for Doug Ford because he took the Science Center away, and I will never forgive him for that. Be easy, y'all.